make sure I don't blend my few remarks with your talk here, which is on the lectern. First of all, welcome to the Danube Institute, and I'm the president, John O'Sullivan. It gives me great pleasure to see you all here. The topic of the event is described that way, but I would also describe it in a different way. I would say we're here asking what benefit does monarchy give us? And by us, I don't mean simply the British people or indeed any people. I mean, what does it give people who may themselves be monarchists or really particularly approve of monarchy? Well, I begin by making this point, which is on the afternoon of the Queen's death last year, I was attending a conference of the Common Sense Society on History and Politics at Bowood House. Bowood House is a splendid stately home owned by the Lansdowne family, planted confidently in Wiltshire's heart of England. But apart from a few people, mainly lecturers, most of the conference attendees were not British. They were drawn from the United States, from Hungary, and from other European countries. And it wouldn't have been at all surprising, at least in theory, if they had not wanted to pay particular attention to the Queen's passing. Yet, in fact, almost all of them asked for the organisers to arrange a tribute to Her late Majesty at the final dinner that evening. Well, that duty fell to me as the senior Brit present, at least in age. Obviously, on that occasion, the tribute could hardly end with a traditional toast. And the question arose as to what the closing words should be. After the briefest discussions, we agreed quite easily, and I ended my remarks about the Queen's extraordinary life of duty with the standard formula after a royal death. The Queen is dead, long live the King. To my surprise, and as the other people present confirmed to me later at dinner, to their surprise too, they all responded in unison and forcefully, "Long live the King." It was a slightly eerie experience, and after a few moments into the dinner, we fell to discussing the significance of that unexpectedly united and thunderous response, which seemed to come from some deeper place than nostalgia or human sympathy, or even just conventional respect. Maybe from some place that expressed all those sentiments and more. I mention this because as several reporters of the King's coronation, King Charles's coronation 2 days ago, pointed out, something similar seems to have happened to them and to the crowds of mourners who turned out, both in Westminster Abbey and outside, to mourn. As one of them, Rachel Cook, in a remarkably powerful piece of what I would call colour writing, giving a wonderful impression of what it was like to be there and encompassing a lot of different aspects of the conference. It was an event that was huge and hideous, exquisite and sacred all at once. I think that, like other reporters, Rachel Cooks was surprised to find that she had such a powerful feeling of response, favourable overall, particularly after the elements of the ceremony that had a religious background. Because after all, most of the people writing those reports are not themselves religious, certainly probably not Christians or Anglican. So what does this mean? What explains the power of monarchy over us? And can that power be used even by people who resist the monarchy and the usual justifications for the monarchy? Well, to answer that question and others, we're very lucky to have Lee Cohen as one of 5 people today who will be discussing this question. Lee will be the master of ceremonies. I yield my place to him on the stage. And he is someone who spent years as a foreign policy advisor on Anglo-American affairs in Western Europe to the US House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee. He's a frequent editorial contributor to national papers, local, and specialty publications. He is a transatlantic fellow of our institute here, as well as the UK's Bruges Group and the Bow Group, specializing in the Anglo-American relationship and constitutional monarchy. In addition to his foreign policy experience, Lee has spent years as the communications director in executive and legislative branches of government. Now, I could go on to list his other experiences, and we have four distinguished commentators along with him here today. They are Barry Legg, Zoltan Becci, Mark Falkoff, and returning to this question from her triumphant prediction that about 3 years ago, that the Duchess of Sussex would prove to be a difficult person to handle for the royal family. We have Anne Elizabeth Moutet. I think I've mentioned all four now. Well, I think this is going to be a fascinating occasion. I think this is one of those occasions which deals with politics, but also with other elements in human life and society that go somewhat deeper than politics. And I myself am looking forward to learning a great deal. Thank you. Lee Cohen.
Thank you so much, John. It's such a pleasure to be back here in Hungary. And it's so wonderful to be at a place in the world where one doesn't have to censor one's thoughts like occasionally in my own homeland at the moment. So certainly one's expressed thoughts. So good afternoon. With the crowning Saturday of Britain's newest king, Charles III, and the worldwide media attention that event has received, what a timely moment to consider the role of monarchy in our times, how we got here, and the future of this system of government. The word monarchy comes from the Greek, meaning power is held by one person, and generally it passes to his or her heirs upon death. Once the most common form of government, monarchy has a long history in Europe, essentially dominating from the Middle Ages until the First World War. By contrast, today, most European countries have ceased to be monarchies, and 3/4 of the member states of the European Union are now republics. The embattled Egyptian king Farouk quipped in 1948, "Soon there will be only 5 kings in the world, 4 in a pack of cards, and the King of England." But there is much to be said even in our times in defense of monarchies. Of the modern European monarchies that remain, Denmark, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and the UK. Also, Spain is in there, but not on the follow-on for my next remark. A 2020 study by The Economist magazine tells us that these are among the globe's most democratic nations. Furthermore, according to reports compiled by the United Nations, 7 of the top 10 countries in the world in terms of quality of life are constitutional monarchies. As the saying goes, you can't argue with success. Why, even in our privilege-begrudging times, there remains interest in monarchy as a desirable form of government, because by its nature and design, monarchy strikes a chord with the public that cannot be duplicated by elected politicians. King Charles's coronation has received huge coverage in global print and broadcast outlets during the last few months. Why is there so much worldwide interest in what, for most of us, is a foreign head of state? After all, in my native America, we rejected the institution Charles now heads nearly 250 years ago. Our discussions here today are going to focus on what it is that makes monarchy, at first glance so archaic in our times, still relevant and even impactful. So too, my colleagues and I will consider how the history of monarchy in Europe has shaped international relations and contributed significantly to our geopolitical situation today. The story of monarchy involves territories, nation-states, and military conquests, but as we shall see, illustrated by the pivotal years of the First World War, strikingly, relationships among families, when those families are sovereigns of nations, can have global ramifications. I'm going to open the presentation making the case that when my country, America, rejected the monarchy, claiming our independence from Britain in 1776, and became a post-colonial republic, that we gave up something precious, something that may even have prevented the crippling divisions that plague the United States of America today. While politics divides, monarchy unites. Bruges Group Chairman Barry Legg will then discuss British perspectives on monarchy with a deep dive into the fascinating relationship between sovereign and prime minister. Dr. Mark Falkoff from Florida, my home state, will enlighten us as to the downfall of some of Europe's key dynastic families, the Habsburg, Hohenzollern, and Romanov dynasties. Columnist Anne Elizabeth Moutet will provide analysis of monarchy in the French Revolution, how France has been affected by being a former monarchy. Professor Zoltán Bécsi will address Hungary's experience, Magna Carta, the events of 1514, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire from 1867 on to the end in 1918. At the end, we will leave some time for questions. Hopefully you'll have some. Thank you so much for this opportunity to address you today. In my capacity as foreign policy analyst, royal commentator, and journalist who writes on the transatlantic relationship, I felt compelled to travel to the United Kingdom last week to celebrate a historic moment with America's mother country. After all, the last time this occasion arose was 70 years ago, even before my time, although you might not know it looking at me. But so, too, I committed to making this trip to honor the oldest functioning political institution in Europe. Let me say it again. Monarchy is the oldest functioning political institution in Europe. Far from being simply an old world ceremonial bauble, the British monarchy represents a political heritage not of tyranny, but of fairness, freedom, tolerance, and justice. That is America's political inheritance. A copy of Magna Carta rests side by side with the Declaration of Independence in Washington, D.C. in the National Archives. And this is really a tribute of the importance of monarchical assent to the groundbreaking English principle that everyone has the same status before the law. During the English Civil War, 1642 to 51, Charles I launched a constitutional crisis when he tried to rule without parliament. In the aftermath, Britain became ground zero for concerns of mankind's fundamental freedoms and pioneered policies addressing religious, speech, press, and assembly freedoms. All of these were adopted as foundational principles codified in the United States Constitution. Ironically, but categorically, with the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the monarchy became champions of rule of law and catalysts for self-government, another great inheritance which enabled the ascendancy of the United States. The joint monarchs of this pivotal moment, Mary and William of Orange, have perhaps not received their due for contributions to British and American exceptionalism. The founding of the Bank of England assured the commercial ascendancy and global competitiveness of Britain, which downstream affected Britain's colonies. After the catastrophic reign of James II, who tried to reverse the English Reformation and ended up alienating all factions of support and then fleeing to France, William and Mary restored constitutional order as champions of rule of law. They accepted the Bill of Rights drawn up by Parliament, which limited monarchical power, reaffirmed Parliament's claim to control taxation and legislation, and provided guarantees against the abuses of power which James II and the other Stuart kings had committed. In effect, William and Mary agreed to limiting their own power and to supporting government by consent of the people. In so doing, their behavior shaped the course of American democracy, considering that the policies enacted in the English Bill of Rights of 1689 were wholesale adopted in America. The English bill was the model text for the subsequent American Bill of Rights, shaping America's Constitution. The ideas, documents, and legislation that emerged from the reign of William and Mary and the Glorious Revolution shaped the fundamental laws of the North American colonies as much, if not more so, than any notions conceived by America's founders. We Americans might have fought to establish ourselves as a republic in the 18th century, but we remain powerfully inspired and influenced by the status and presence of the British monarch. And we are far from alone. As noted by former British Prime Minister Alec Douglas Hume, quote, "The Queen's appearances abroad do more in a day to gain goodwill for Britain than all the politicians and diplomats lumped together could achieve in years." Notwithstanding ups and downs from public scrutiny, after Princess Diana's death and more recently from Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's attacks on the royal family, Queen Elizabeth II enjoyed huge popularity even among Americans. A YouGov poll concluded late in her reign. It indicated that a large majority of Americans had strongly positive views of the Queen, equating to a favorability rating of, wait for it, 68%. To put that in perspective, American President Joe Biden in his latest approval ratings, does anyone have any idea? Pretty close, a little higher, 43%. So the Queen's polling at 68%, Joe Biden's polling at 43%. Comparing these two numbers underscores several things. Firstly, that America, like the rest of the world, deeply admires the monarchy and the late Queen, who was as much a fixture of our lives as around the world. But so, too, it shows the merit of a global leader who represents non-divisive political principles such as nation, history, patriotism, and faith. Contrast this with the opinion ratings of politicians, which we just did, who adopt agendas which invariably divide rather than unite. The interest monarchs inspire outside of their kingdoms stem not from military might nor trade policy. Rather, that respect relates to presence, standing, and the unique ability to embody in human form the enduring qualities of a nation. While King Charles and his mother before him wields little political power, nevertheless, their soft power is significant, and its capacity to assist Britain's diplomatic goals is priceless. While Britain's global status has diminished in the post-colonial era, the monarchy has bolstered its image and prestige worldwide and has been an offsetting factor in that diminution. In his book on the topic, Joseph Nye defines soft power as the ability to affect others to obtain the outcomes one wants through attraction rather than coercion or payment. Queen Elizabeth was particularly adept in using her role and presence to secure Britain's diplomatic goals. With the goodwill Charles seems to generate overseas, it is likely that he will continue that trend. Considering the importance of the U.S.-UK relationship, both to the two nations themselves and to the well-being of the wider world, Prince Charles and his mother before him recognized the importance of the so-called special relationship. Queen Elizabeth spent valuable time charming 13 out of 14 of the U.S. presidents who coincided with her reign, and in the process, cementing the relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. She helped preserve relations even in the turbulent 1957 after the Suez tensions, and she offset divergence about involvement in the Vietnam War, with Britain having a different opinion than the United States, and differing approaches of Richard Nixon and then Prime Minister Edward Heath. More recently, the late monarch focused a charm offensive on President Trump to promote British interests during his tenure. Throughout her 70-plus year reign, the Queen was host and guest, respectively, on both sides of the Atlantic to every U.S. president except Lyndon Johnson. And that's a long story, for which we don't have time right now, but I can tell you after if you like. Now it falls to King Charles to use the unique qualities his position affords to steer Britain through a new globalized, post-colonial world. A republic such as the United States has a different, more distant relationship between nation and people. We have no permanent state head or family to inspire national pride or communal patriotic feelings. Rather, we have an object, a flag. Our soldiers fight and die in the name of an object rather than a human embodiment of nation. And I would suggest that removing the human element, the historic symbolism and the links to a great dynastic past does not move hearts and minds to the extent and in the same way that a skilled monarch and supportive royal family can. Moreover, while a monarch's power is but ceremonial, it is nevertheless real and can be quite impactful. The existence of a monarch in Britain challenges politicians and holds them to a higher standard. So too, by representing the interests of all citizens of a nation, a monarch can help modulate any extremism that can arise in republics where temporary majorities can determine who ends up running a country. Winston Churchill memorably affirmed this point. He said, "It is wise in human affairs and in the government of men to separate pomp from power." My colleagues today will address the fall of European monarchy in Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Russia. The governments that replaced monarchs in those locations abandoned the moderating influence existing where monarchs and politicians reign and govern together. Democracy was sacrificed in these instances for the tyranny of communism and fascism. Happily, most of those subsequent regimes, too, didn't endure. Britain is unique because the same forces that impelled Britons to preserve their monarchy prevented the establishment of tyranny and absolutism. And I know I'm getting the time is running short symbol, so I'm just going to rush through to make a couple points. Why should Americans who got rid of monarchy in 1776 care so deeply? We were all taught in school that tyrannical George III needed to be opposed, and we wrote all of our grievances down in the Declaration of Independence, as if we, and not the English, invented constitutional liberty. It is difficult for most Americans to wrap their minds around the intimate mutual affection that Britons and members of the Commonwealth had for the Queen, and the blessings of stability, national pride, and cohesion. I'm going to just jump to the end because I'm... Also hard to grasp is that the United Kingdom is comprised of 4 nations, sometimes with competing interests, and that the monarchy is the glue that holds these pieces together. In the case of a president of the United States, I imagine not too many would credit him or her, if ever there is to be a her, with holding our federal republic together. Unarguably, as a constitutional republic, the United States has been a stunning success, the world's foremost constitutional democracy. With all of our good intentions, however, by combining the roles of head of state and head of government, we lost something profound. Unavoidably, under the U.S. Constitution, these roles are held together by a single politician. Only very rarely, if ever, has a president been able to hold a candle to Queen Elizabeth, and if they did, it was only for a fraction of the duration of her reign. Even in an anti-monarchist colonial America, getting rid of, as universally adopted, a political system as monarchy was not easy. Many colonial Americans viewed themselves as patriotic Englishmen and remained loyal to the powerful symbolism and paternalistic safeguards the crown provided, particularly with respect to the Protestant faith. Americans may think we got rid of a monarch in our U.S. system, but what are presidents really but elected temporary kings? The founder of America even invested the new American president with comparatively absolute powers most British monarchs would have envied. In America, unlike our mother nation, we have an elected temporary monarch perpetually in fundraising mode for his party, at the helm of whom brings all of the political divisiveness but none of the unity. No wonder at their inaugurations all presidents promise to unite, with few results in that regard. I'm just going to jump ahead for sake of time. The interaction of the U.S. president, the so-called leader of the free world, though only ever in office for 8 years and a monarch for life, with more years of experience than the lifespan of some of the presidents they have dealt with, is a fascinating one. And though we Americans dispense with constitutional attachment to monarchy in 1776, somehow that bond remains, albeit with occasional baggage. Why on earth are world leaders so stirred by the former Queen Elizabeth? After all, her power was largely ceremonial and symbolic. The monarch's jurisdiction, as British author Walter Bagehot explained in the English Constitution, not in the English Constitution, but a book called the English Constitution, is limited to the right to be consulted, the right to encourage, and the right to warn. This is explained further by a more contemporary author, Robert Hardman. He shed some light. He said that there are those all over the world, even in countries that have no connection with the crown she wears, who feel a close affinity for this unchanging global figure. As the Queen approached her 90th birthday, the American ambassador to Britain reflected on her transnational, if not universal, appeal at the end of an evening at Buckingham Palace. Not only is the Queen the constant for this country, he said, but for the rest of us. Though his reign will only last a fraction of his mother's, the same is likely true of Charles. For all of his positive qualities, King Charles has deep shoes to fill, and at 74, not much time. But though his realm may shrink in the near future, considering the public support for the continuation of the monarchy and the popularity of Charles's son William, it will not disappear. Australia's 28th Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, has expanded upon this point. He said the monarchy is unlikely to disappear while human beings retain their respect for order, continuity, and ceremony, and that which summons us to be our best selves. As for the United States, we are never going to readopt monarchy, but we would do well to pay attention to the stabilizing and unifying benefits that are associated with constitutional monarchies. A beloved, apolitical figure who unites and reminds us of the noblest elements of our history and values is perhaps the missing piece to assuage the seething divisions and angst that now plague the United States of America. Thank you. Okay, so our next speaker, thank you very much for your kind attention. Our next speaker is the Honorable Barry Legg. Barry is a longtime leader of the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom. He currently serves as chairman of the Bruges Group since 2008. His many leadership positions include chief executive of the Conservative Party under the leadership of the Right Honorable Ian Duncan Smith, MP, campaign manager for John Redwood, MP, for leadership of the Conservative Party, and Finance Bill Committee 1992 to 1997, and amending government tax legislation on the floor of the House. And Barry will be joining us virtually. Is Barry ready to go? Here he is.
Hello. Well, thank you, Lee, very much for that introduction. We've not actually spoken prior to this conference about the subject matter today, but I can assure you there'll be a lot of continuity from me, following on from the comments that you've made yourself. I'd just like to begin with an overview of Brexit and its deep constitutional implications. Joining and leaving was the central political issue which spanned the whole of Elizabeth II's 70-year reign. The Brexit process also helps to clarify Britain's relationship with continental Europe, stretching back over several centuries, and the role of the monarch in those developments. Some of what I have to say is based on my own personal experience and interactions with some of the leading political players in the UK. I'd like to begin in the early hours of the morning on a day in January 1993, when I took a break from debating the Maastricht Treaty in the chamber of the House of Commons. 2 months earlier, I was one of 23 Conservative members of Parliament who voted against the government's legislation to implement the Maastricht Treaty. In my case, legislating to abolish the pound and replace it with a single European currency made Maastricht a treaty too far. By January 1993, the committee stage of the bill was taking place on the floor of the House of Commons. And on occasions, the continuous debate could last longer than 24 hours, with the next day's parliamentary business being lost as a result. That day, having left the chamber in the early hours of the morning, I walked to the smoking room of the House of Commons. There I found a lone figure sitting at a table. It was Edward Heath, the former Prime Minister and Britain's leading advocate of European Union membership. 40 years earlier, in 1960, he had been charged by Prime Minister Harold Macmillan with negotiating our entry to the so-called common market. But de Gaulle, smarting from his treatment both by Britain and the United States during the Second World War, exercised his veto on British membership. Some 10 years later, in 1970, Heath, then as Prime Minister, succeeded in negotiating Britain's membership of the European Community. Some believed this step could revive an ailing British economy. As a schoolboy, I had been tasked with writing an essay entitled, "Britain has lost an empire, but failed to find a role." The words came from Dean Acheson, the United States Secretary of State. The implied answer to this question was that Britain should accept the Treaty of Rome and join the so-called common market. But back to the smoking room of the House of Commons in the early hours of the morning in January 1993. I turned to Edward Heath sitting alone at his table and said, "Ted, can I get you a drink?" He replied, "Make mine a Glenmorangie." I obliged and joined our former Prime Minister and architect of our European Union membership at his table. He took a sip of his Glenmorangie, looked me in the eye and said, "It's all Anthony's fault." I knew exactly what he meant. Anthony was Anthony Eden, Churchill's successor as Prime Minister, Britain's leading foreign policy expert for over 20 years, the man who had resigned as Chamberlain's Foreign Secretary, being wary of the policy of appeasement. What did Edward Heath mean when he said to me, "It's all Anthony's fault"? He meant that when Eden became Prime Minister in 1956, he should have sent British representatives to the Messina Conference, at which the original 6 members of the European Community met to discuss their plans for the future. My view is that even by 1956, the die was almost certainly cast, and Monnet's concept of the Action Committee for the United States of Europe, which had been formed in 1955, was the direction of travel. There were, however, fundamental reasons why Britain did not join the European Community in the very beginning. Heath, indeed, would have been present in the chamber of the House of Commons in May 1953, when Prime Minister Winston Churchill set out his views on this issue. It was some 20 days before the coronation of Elizabeth II at Westminster Abbey, and almost exactly 70 years before our meeting today. Churchill told the House on the 11th of May 1953, "We are with Europe, but not of it. If Britain must choose between Europe and the open sea, she must always choose the open sea." These were remarkable words of the man who served in the First World War and saved Britain from Nazi Germany in the Second, going on to form an alliance which freed Europe from Nazi control. They were also remarkable words from a direct descendant of the Duke of Marlborough, the victor of Blenheim and Ramillies, of whom Winston Churchill wrote a detailed biography. Winston Churchill knew that in the aftermath of those two victories, Britain and the European powers diverged markedly in their constitutional development. In 1714, Britain's leading parliamentarians took a decisive step in establishing unfettered parliamentary democracy. In choosing the Elector of Hanover to be the British monarch, a man said to be 51st in line of succession, they chose an unambiguous Protestant and closed the door on the turbulent century of schism and civil war under a series of Stuart monarchs. During George's reign, during which the monarch spent serious amounts of time in his native Hanover, the power of the monarchy diminished and Britain began a transition to the modern system of constitutional government led by a prime minister. During much of George's reign, the centre of political power was held by Robert Walpole. Britain was now set on a path to a system of ever-widening democratic accountability. There were political and constitutional changes throughout these centuries, supported by economic developments. During the 16th and 17th centuries, economic developments were enhancing the aspirations of those below the royal lineage. The break with Rome under Henry VIII was accompanied by the dissolution of the monarchy, the monasteries, with the upper echelons of society benefiting personally from that redistribution of wealth. There was also a time when Britain's growing influence as a maritime force meant that the exploitation of the world's riches benefited a growing class of British adventurers and distributors of newfound wealth. With the ever-widening of democratic accountability since the days of Walpole, the role of the monarchy in British politics has become closely defined. Today, the monarch has a duty to warn and advise the Prime Minister of the day, but that process takes place in the privacy of the weekly audience between Prime Minister and King. Edward Heath, as Prime Minister, used the Queen to undertake a state visit to President Pompidou. Doubtless he hoped that such an occasion could strengthen relationships between both countries and led to Pompidou softening the Gaullist hostility to British membership. But in reality, no one knew what Elizabeth truly thought. Her speeches were also always littered to references to her views, to the views of her government, not her own personal views. The modern constitutional framework allows the monarch to have an input to political decisions within the framework of the weekly audiences with the Prime Minister. And within that environment, the right to warn and advise. It would undermine the whole basis of our democracy if our monarch publicly took a political stance or indeed publicly supported government or opposition policies. King Charles III, beware. Some ask whether King Charles can answer the need for some sort of national unity, especially when the nation is so deeply divided after Brexit. There is a negative argument for monarchy, no less persuasive for being so, that it offers a way for people of strongly opposed opinions to share at least a common sense of affinity in being part of the country's history, institutions, and habits without letting the bitterness of division overwhelm patriotic sentiment. I'd now like to briefly look at the role of Elizabeth and her relationship with her prime ministers. Firstly, it's important to remember her background. She came out of the abdication crisis of 1936, when her uncle, Edward VIII, abdicated as king and was succeeded by his ill-prepared brother, George VI, Elizabeth's father. And secondly, by the rise of Adolf Hitler, Prime Minister Chamberlain's policy of appeasement, and then the Second World War. These were dominant influences on Elizabeth. Her parents unwisely associated themselves with the policy of appeasement by inviting Chamberlain onto the balcony of Buckingham Palace to celebrate his supposed success at Munich. But within 18 months or so, they were required to accept the unrelenting leadership of Winston Churchill. Elizabeth's mother famously declared when Buckingham Palace was bombed that now we can look the East End in the face. When Elizabeth herself became queen in 1952, the events of the Second World War still loomed large and continued to do so for several decades. Elizabeth's education had been informal and very private. Churchill remained a national hero, and Elizabeth's capacity to influence the course of events through her use of the prerogative to warn and advise her prime minister were limited against this background. Churchill's successor as prime minister, Anthony Eden, brought in a period of turbulence. Firstly, Elizabeth, under political and courtly pressure, suspended her sister's romance to a divorced man. A somewhat surprising decision when social mores were already changing, and her own Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, himself a divorced man, had married the niece of Winston Churchill, Clarissa. The premiership of Eden was dominated by Suez. The question of whether Britain and France collaborated to engineer a British invasion of Egypt, and the decision of the Republican President Dwight Eisenhower, also the former commander of Allied forces in Europe, to effectively require British withdrawal from Egypt. The fragility of British leadership, little more than 10 years after the end of the war, was abruptly and brutally exposed. Eden resigned as Prime Minister on grounds of health, and the Marquis of Salisbury, whose ancestor was the Chief Minister of Elizabeth I, took cabinet soundings to determine who should succeed, famously asking leading cabinet ministers to answer the question, Wab or Harold, the two leading contenders being Harold Macmillan and R.A. Butler. Elizabeth played no part in these political soundings and dutifully summoned Macmillan to kiss her hand on appointment. Macmillan doubted that he could remain in office for more than a few months, but he managed to survive and win in a general election for the Conservatives. Although an old Etonian, he was conscious of his family's background in trade, even though he had managed to marry the daughter of a duke. His premiership descended into frustration with Britain's application to join the common market being vetoed by de Gaulle. Macmillan's Keynesian-inspired efforts to manage the economy were frustratingly labelled stop-go. Macmillan increasingly seemed to be a relic of times past, as Beatlemania swept the country. But despite this, he sought to pass the baton of leadership to a true aristocrat, his Foreign Secretary, Sir Alec, at that time, the Earl of Hume. This time there was no Lord Salisbury to take cabinet soundings, and Macmillan on his sickbed in the Edward VII Hospital for Officers summoned the Queen to make her aware of his soundings. Macmillan's choice was the Earl of Hume, a friend of the royal family and an exact contemporary of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, with both coming from the highest echelons of Scottish society. The arcane system by which the Conservative hierarchy selected its leaders and the monarch accepted those choices, at this point almost imploded. Before Elizabeth could summon the Earl of Hume to kiss hands, some of his cabinet revolted and insisted that R.A. Butler, the architect of the UK's post-war prosperity, must have the keys of number 10. Butler saved the day by declining office, and Elizabeth was able to appoint the Earl of Hume in accordance with Macmillan's wishes. However, within a year, the left-wing Harold Wilson had won a closely fought election and was in a grand limousine on the way to Buckingham Palace to become the Queen's first socialist prime minister. Initially, Elizabeth was fearful of Mr. Wilson's political agenda, but his actions in government were much less radical than his speeches in opposition. Wilson was a mere 5 years older than Elizabeth, whereas all of her previous Conservative prime ministers had really come from an older generation. Like Macmillan, he sought to secure membership of the common market, but again, de Gaulle declined this prospect. Elizabeth began a process of trying to get an increase in the civil list, a polite terminology for the monarch's financial allowance from the taxpayer, which had remained frozen since 1952. Its value had been lessened by the ravages of inflation, and the patrician leaders of the Conservative Party had not seen fit to support their royalist rhetoric with hard cash. The socialist Wilson accepted in principle the Queen's case for a rise, but like the pledge to be virtuous, it was a case of not just yet. And now I come to Elizabeth's relationship with her greatest and longest serving Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. They were only 6 months apart in age, and of course both were women, but the similarities really ended there. Margaret Thatcher was about reform and change, whereas the constitutional monarch is very much about maintaining balance and traditions. Their views on society were different. And while they were not in complete conflict, there inevitably were tensions between Prime Minister and monarch. The education and career of the two women can hardly have been more different, but both benefited from having the most supportive of husbands. Margaret's ambitions and educational achievements were driven by her father's sense of the need to be committed to personal improvement. Elizabeth's education was deliberately limited and focused somewhat narrowly on the procedures of monarchy. Margaret made her way in the world, while Elizabeth's future was set in stone from the abdication of her uncle. Political and economic change in Britain was delayed for decades, and the status quo only really significantly changed under Attlee and Thatcher. Thatcher put socialism on the back foot, and those on the left that sought to frustrate her objectives were branded supporters of the failed status quo. The strife within the country was probably contrary to Elizabeth's instincts, but an attempt by the monarch to caution against reform would have cast her as a defender of a broken status quo. Monarch and Prime Minister had different perspectives on the Commonwealth. The monarch was the head of the Commonwealth, the Prime Minister a participant in the political issues which absorbed all of its members. The Queen's understanding of Britain's institutions meant differences arose, but constitutional priorities were always observed. In conclusion, I believe that Elizabeth was a unique constitutional monarch who successfully navigated these changing times and ensured the monarchy maintained its role at the center of our national life.
Thank you very much, Barry. We're going to go along to our next presenter, Dr. Mark Falkoff. Dr. Falkoff is an historian who has taught at several American universities and at the U.S. Foreign Service Institute in Washington, D.C., and the NATO Defense College in Rome. He was, for a time, also a staff member of the Committee on Foreign Relations of the United States Senate. He divides his time between Palm Beach, Florida, and Munich, Germany. Okay, Mark, I've already introduced you, so please take it away.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be in Budapest, even virtually. I hope to be there in propria persona one of these days soon. I'm going to talk about a rather somber subject, and that is the collapse of three great European monarchies. It's a remarkable subject because in July 1914, on the eve of the First World War, there were 12 monarchies in Europe. After the First World War, only 9 remained, and the 3 that had lost the war collapsed or were overthrown and replaced by republics. I suppose the short answer to the story is, or the short moral of the story is, lost wars are harmful to monarchies and other living things. But with the possible exception of the Russian case, I think the disappearance of at least 2 of the 3 monarchies was not necessarily foretold. The first of these was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, certainly familiar to people in Budapest. And we need to be reminded that in 1914, it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire was one of the largest economic spaces in the world. It was an empire of 50 million inhabitants. It comprised the largest market in Europe after Russia and Germany, and it possessed many qualities of a highly civilized country. It had a multinational parliament. It had a free press. It had a brilliant cultural life. One needs only to evoke names like Gustav Mahler or Dvorak, Franz Kafka, Joseph Roth, or the Secessionist School of Architecture. One need only visit the Design Museum in Vienna to get a full sense of the creativity of this society. The reigning monarch, Franz Joseph, was at that time completing nearly 70 years on the throne and enjoyed vast prestige and affection among his people. I always invite people to look at the film The Radetzky March, which is based on Joseph Roth's novel. You can see it on YouTube, and you can see a depiction of Franz Joseph visiting the easternmost part of his empire just before the war, and the film depicts very I think, movingly, the enormous affection and prestige that the emperor had. There's a tendency nowadays to emphasize the forces of disunion in this empire among its various subject nationalities, particularly the Czechs. But we should not lose sight of the forces of cohesion. There was the prestige of the court, the discipline of the army, the good organization of administration, the loyalty of the peasant class, which relied upon the throne to protect it against the depredations of feudal lords. And the crown represented a kind of a barrier against pan-Germanism or pan-Slavism, one or the other taking over the society. The most loyal, not surprisingly, the most loyal constituency of the monarchy were the Jews, who had no country other than the monarchy. But as Francois who points out in a remarkable book, which I recommend to you. It's available in French. The title in French is Requiem for a Defunct Empire. He points out that not all of the subject nationalities of the empire were dreaming of separation, and he particularly documents the case of the Croats, who remained loyal to the throne almost to the end. Now, of course, there were problems, particularly a succession crisis. In 1889, the heir to the throne committed suicide with his lover in a hunting lodge, to be succeeded by the emperor's nephew, Franz Ferdinand. And at the time of Franz Josef's death in 1916, in the middle of the war, he was 86 at the time, Franz Ferdinand was already toying with the idea of a federal solution to the nationalities issue in the empire. I have always felt that Franz Ferdinand was a very dangerous man to the Serbs and may have had something to do with their involvement in his assassination. I follow the work of Christopher Clark in his book, The Sleepwalkers, which I think pretty well documents the connection between the assassination and the Serbian secret police. Emperor Karl was Franz Josef's great nephew, who succeeded to the throne in 1916, and he too was toying with some sort of arrangement which would more fully integrate the subject nationalities into the monarchical system. He was toying with what they call a trialist solution, which would put the Croats on the same level as the German Austrians and the Hungarians. But the war was going very badly for the Austro-Hungarian army. Unlike on the Eastern Front, the Russian army was not doing well against the Germans. But on the Eastern Front of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian army was not doing well against the Russians. And as early as 1917, Emperor Karl realized that the war was unwinnable and attempted to achieve a separate peace. He sent feelers through his brothers-in-law, who were officers in the French army, to Clemenceau. Clemenceau managed to leak the thing to the press. Of course, the Emperor of Germany found out about it, and that ended any possibility of a separate peace for Austria-Hungary. And by this time, the United States had entered the war. And this was very dangerous for Austria-Hungary because President Woodrow Wilson, who had already done what he could to destroy the United States, was now interested in applying his Presbyterian imagination to Central Europe with the notion of self-determination. And in fact, Wilson would not deal with a unified empire and insisted on the abdication of Emperor Karl in order to achieve a peace solution with the defunct empire. So that was the end of that. Let's move to Germany. Again, we need to be careful not to overestimate the forces that brought the German Empire down. In 1914, it was the most successful country in Europe, not just in terms of economic weight, but in terms of its potential for the future. It was the scene of a remarkable cultural and scientific efflorescence. It was the educational magnet for all of Central and Eastern Europe, and the German language was the language of educated people all of the countries east of the Elbe River, and indeed even beyond the Vistula River. The political system itself was a curious mixture of authoritarian monarchy and imperfect democracy. It had a parliament, but the Kaiser dismissed and chose and dismissed ministers. Nonetheless, the Social Democrats were the largest single party in the Reichstag and the most important social democratic party in Europe. At the peak, at the pinnacle of this system, of course, was Emperor Wilhelm II, an easy man to caricature, insecure, pompous. He had an inferiority complex vis-a-vis England, the country of his mother. but he was far less powerful in the day-to-day running of the state than one might suppose from all his titles, one of which was the all-highest. During the war, in fact, he was shunted aside by the generals, and by the end of the war was totally irrelevant. Two dramatic steps which were taken late in the war had huge consequences for Germany and indeed for the entirety of Europe. The first was the decision to facilitate the return of Lenin to Russia, since he was pledged to take his country out of the war, which he did. The other was the authorization of unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic, which brought the United States into the war. There's a kind of dirty secret about this, and that is that the United States was busy shipping weapons and ammunition to the Allies in violation of its own neutrality legislation, but the point remains that the Lusitania was sunk and other ships were sunk, and this is what brought the United States into the war. And of course, once the United States was into the war, it wasn't enough just to win the war. One had to completely refashion the world according to Wilsonian notions, which included, of course, the end of the monarchy in Germany as a condition for fulfillment of the armistice agreements. And now I turn to Russia. I must confess that I have a kind of ghoulish fascination with the collapse of the Russian monarchy. On my father's side, I descend from people who fled the Russian Empire. I have absolutely no affection whatever for the Russian monarchy, and this will become clear in my presentation. In 1913, the Romanov dynasty celebrated its 300th anniversary, making it one of the oldest monarchies in the world, and to a superficial observer, it had never been more powerful. The final years of the regime were a paradox. It was one of increasing prosperity and economic development, largely thanks to French investment on a quite massive scale in Russia. And of course, we all know about the brilliant cultural life of Russia centered in St. Petersburg. But unlike Germany or Austria-Hungary, Russia was an autocracy, or at least it was supposed to be an autocracy, that is to say, one-man rule. It had no parliament until 1905, and even then that parliament was completely powerless. It had a heavily censored press and an overactive secret police, which was infiltrated by double and triple agents. The autocrat, Nicholas II, was stupid and naive, wholly unprepared for the task of governing a huge multinational empire, although one has to say, in all fairness, this is a point made by Dominic Levin in his apologetic biography of Nicholas, really nobody could do this. Well, there's no doubt nobody could do this, but I would say Nicholas was perhaps the least qualified of a number of Russian monarchs to do so. He was driven by his wife, a most unfortunate woman, Empress Alexandra, who was a German princess who'd been raised in England, but after her marriage to Nicholas, tried to become more Russian than thou. She never really learned the language very well. Her husband and she used to talk to each other in English, but nonetheless, she was constantly urging Nicholas to become more oppressive. She used to say, the Russian people need to feel the knout, to be like Ivan the Terrible, and so on. She was jealous of anyone who seemed more capable than her husband, which, of course, was not difficult to find. She got rid of his most able minister, Sergei Witte, and she would have gotten rid of Pyotr Stolyopin, who was the most creative of all of the imperial ministers of that time, but he was dispatched by an assassin before she could get rid of him. The assassin may indeed have been in the pay of the secret police. It's very unclear exactly what happened there. She persuaded him to dismiss his uncle, who was the commander-in-chief of the Russian army, and assume command of the army himself during the war. This, of course, meant that the whole prestige of the monarchy was mortgaged to success on the battlefield, which did not happen. Looking back on the last years of the Russian monarchy, one tends to marvel that it lasted as long as it did. It was nearly toppled in 1905, following the defeat of a war with Japan. The monarch himself and high officials lived in constant fear of assassination, and with reason. His grandfather was blown to pieces in his carriage in 1881. His brother-in-law, the governor of Moscow, was dispatched with a bomb in the street. And perhaps many of you have seen this famous photograph of all the monarchs of Europe seated with George V at the funeral of Queen Victoria. There's one monarch missing, Nicholas II. He did not dare leave his country. And in fact, more than 17,000 people were killed or wounded in terrorist attacks in the last years of the monarchy. Now, a society like this, moving towards some sort of economic and social modernity, but with a political system of questionable legitimacy, lived in permanent peril, and all it took was an unsuccessful war to bring it down. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Falkhoff. And actually, I've already introduced our next speaker, so I'll just say very briefly, Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, columnist for The Telegraph, Unheard, France Info TV, and the European Conservative, and she's going to address the French monarchy.
I'm going to address it, and I hope to have a conversation with you because I think there have been lots of speeches. But I'll it's very interesting, and I was really interested in listening to you and listening to the other speakers because you can see that every country, it's a bit like unhappy families in Tolstoy. Every happy family is the same. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own personal way, in its own different way. And it's the same thing with monarchies. What do you have in common between the Tsars, which Mark just evoked, this sort of short-sighted autocracy, which was comforted essentially by the knowledge that they had a secret police and a long arm and lots of camps in Siberia. The Bolsheviks did not invent them by Siberia. And what's the difference between them and Prince Charles, whose picture we see here? A long sort of tradition ever since the Noble Revolution of 1688 in Britain, where it's essentially the monarch is so benign that when you think about the Napoleonic Wars, they are not fought by the king. They are fought by Pitt, they're fought by Fox, they're fought by the prime ministers of the day. The king is hovering over this as a presence, and sometimes in the case of George IV, a coming presence, but as a sort of symbol of continuity, and they're all so different that when the French look at this, and with their own peculiar reason for sort of having experienced monarchy as something pretty autocratic, even when it was no longer, we, having overset in a fairly bloody way in a popular revolution, the French monarchy, they are not interested in having another one. And it wouldn't work with us, but it would work in other countries. And the most sort of obvious example in recent memory is when General Franco, who became the caudillo of Spain, had a long time in power and decided that monarchy would be best reintroduced to Spain when he died with a king. So he finds a Bourbon, who's Juan Carlos de Bourbon, and appoints him, and everybody thinks, he is the pet Bourbon of the caudillo, and it's just going to be Frankism with a royal face. And 6 years later, Juan Carlos prevents Spain from falling into a dictatorship again. There's a coup in the Cortes. There's a group of factious military who go into the Cortes and take the parliament hostage, and it's the king who calls for them to stop. That also was, they were very lucky that Juan Carlos was intelligent. From the accounts that we have about meetings that advisors to American presidents had with Franco towards the end of his life, he knew perfectly well what he was doing. And he expected Juan Carlos to behave exactly like that. Vernon Walters in particular talks about this. Vernon Walters, with both at different times, he was an American sort of ambassador to France and other places, and he was also the head of the CIA. He's recounted going to see Franco 1 year before Franco died, and Franco saying, "I found a good king, I have created a middle class, this country will go fine when I'm dead." Each country has got a different relationship with their king. Each monarchy has developed itself in a different way. I admire the Belgians immensely because they had a king and no government for 500 days, and there was no problem whatsoever, which is always a good thing. But I would also say that there is a symbiotic relationship between the way the monarchy moves on and the people. And we've seen this, and that's the reason why we're having this conference. We've seen this in London with this extraordinary sort of grandiose, ridiculous, beautiful, tender, popular ceremony that the British have all sort of joined in. Really, people talk to you about Republicans in England, and they're a tiny little party, and they were nowhere in sight except at sort of designated spots. But there was, even from people who define themselves as not being monarchists, there was the idea that if we've got to have a king, this is the way we want to have a king. The best article, and I advise everyone to read it, was in The Guardian, and it was a wonderful account of this. So, The Guardian, you don't expect The Guardian to write the defining story about what the coronation was like. And it defined Charles and Camilla in their coach holding hands as a pair of elderly polar bears, benign. Again, we're going into the idea that monarchy is something that you have to have affection for, because without the affection for the king, it doesn't exist. And I was delighted that Mark Volkoff brought up Joseph Roth's fantastic novel, Radetzky March. And any of you who hasn't read it, are you in for a treat? You should read it. It is great. But it's 3 generations of Austrians, actually from Croatia, I think, Slovenia. It's a family that's part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is not one single ethnic group. It is lots of nationalities. And even though there was just a strong reaction led by the Austrians against the 1848 revolutions, the great magic of the Austro-Hungarian Empire is that from this bloodbath, which it was, including 9 Hungarian ministers shot here in 1849. And still they brought this idea that the monarchy, with Franz Joseph as the king, as the emperor, the king and emperor, brought again a country that had been wounded by wars and by civil war. So all of this means that monarchy, the idea of monarchy, is a kaleidoscope. It is bound with religion, and we have seen this at the coronation of Charles. We have seen it is bound with the spiritual, which is even beyond religion. It is bound with the idea of tradition. That tradition is like your spine. It holds you. It doesn't force you, but it holds you standing. And this is where things go. So what do countries that do not have a tradition of monarchy or do not like them, when they look back, what do they do with this? And what does my country do with it? I would say that to some extent, we have defined ourselves against monarchy. And you need to have somebody to define yourself. You know that children need when they grow up, they need to define themselves against their parents, against society, and then they, having gone through that, it's a rite of passage, and then they apportion parts for every character in the play. And the way the monarchy in France was finished, which was imitated by Lenin, and Lenin was reading Robespierre when he was taking decisions about killing the Romanov family, was something that was supposed to terrify the rest of Europe. And it did. It provoked an attack by 7 countries against France in 1793. The king is guillotined on will become Place de la Concorde. It is Place de la Nation at the time. And the king is guillotined in February, 21st February of 1793. And his cousins, most of them are his cousins, the allies of Europe. You have Russians who are not cousins. You've got the Austrians who are his cousins. You've got the Belgians. You've got the Prussians. And they all raise armies and converge on France. And France is going to be invaded, and this is what gets the country together. You've got an action, you've got a reaction, and then the reaction to the reaction. And I would recommend that you read in history books the proclamation of general mobilization. Conscription is not just conscription, the entire nation is mobilized to push back the enemies trying to invade the country. And men between 18 and 60 are supposed to fight, and the women are supposed to prepare bandages so that the wounded can be treated. The children are supposed to carry messages, and old people who cannot much move, they will be carried into the public square, and they will exhort the entire nation to rise up. This is the reaction to the idea of monarchs who are trying to come into your country, and monarchs who are not your monarchs, but somebody else's. We had a restoration. The restoration was incredibly benign. It also finally ushered, after Napoleon, the restoration of the Bourbon, the brothers of Louis XVI in France, ushered an era, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. We had 3 kings, two brothers and 1 cousin. We had a very short-lived republic, which is 48 as the time of revolution, to 52. In 52, the president of the republic decides that, after all, he'd rather be an emperor because his name is Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. So, the family has got form. And again, this is the closest we actually get to the harmonizing the benign monarchy of Britain and the more authoritarian monarchy of France. Napoleon III, who is fairly sort of beginning to find sort of popularity in France, but was incredibly unpopular because he made one powerful enemy, who was Victor Hugo. If you have Victor Hugo against you, you are in trouble. And Victor Hugo, who liked Napoleon I, called Napoleon III. Napoleon I was called, like Louis XIV, Napoléon le Grand, the Great, and he called him Napoleon the Petit, the small one. And you can't escape that. We have, in recent decades, we've looked at the monarchy of Napoleon III. We've seen that the speed with which he rebuilt Paris from a medieval city of slums into the city that became the inspiration for Pest, for the way you developed with the boulevards and with the houses and all of this happens at a time of culturally and industrially a very glittering reign, and it is stopped by Bismarck and the Kaiser with the Franco-Prussian War, and then we have a republic, and that republic decides to define itself as, we're not a monarchy. We also do not have an established church, so the republic in France is both not the king, not the church, not the state, no, not the temporal, not the spiritual. This is essentially what defines French fights nowadays. So we have a presence of the monarchy in so many ways in France. It's a negative presence, but it is there. And our reaction is we are secular. We are aggressively secular because the church was the party of reaction, literally. I mean, they reacted against the loss of God and the loss of king. So that's the part it has played. Being French, having gone to school in Britain, I like both. I think they're both different, and you shouldn't try to sort of say, oh, this is better than the other. But I will finish with an anecdote, and then I think we should really have a discussion and to take questions so that it becomes a bit more lively. This is in 1918, and this is in Yekaterinburg. Yekaterinburg is the place where the Romanovs have been taken to be imprisoned, first to be exiled and then imprisoned. And Lenin, having read Robespierre, decides that if you want to strike, you have to kill them. So the entire family is taken into the cellar. The archduchesses, the young Tsarevich, who has got a disease in which his blood does not coagulate, and therefore he's hemophiliac, and therefore he cannot bleed. So he is this sort of sheltered little boy. And the people come down and they shoot them. And they shoot them in this narrow cellar. And not only you have that noise and the bullets, but the archduchesses and the family who'd hoped that they might be able to escape had sewn into the dresses of the girls jewels, diamonds. And the bullets ricocheted against the diamonds. So imagine the carnage, the bullets going everywhere, the blood, in the cellar. That's the beginning of the Bolshevik regime, and that is a beginning that has been wanted. So you've seen, Bolsheviks coming into Budapest at various times. It's not necessarily a nice experience. So I will conclude in saying that I'm not going to take sides on this one, and we should ask questions.
We'll continue with hopefully some questions from you. Although I just wanted to start off after your very interesting presentation, and I wanted to ask you, so both America and France have divested themselves of monarchy, but both get very excited when monarchs visit, particularly the British monarch. And I addressed that a bit in my presentation, and I wanted to hear what you had to say about that.
I think you do not, there's nothing to beat 1,000-year-long tradition, continuous tradition, with elements in ritual, small or big, that have been there continuously for all that time. And there's a fascination. I think there's also the idea that Britain has a certain character, that the certain character is, it can be tough at times, but it also can be very gentle. And that if you look at what, music in England, I'm not talking about rock and roll, although all those rockers who were singing, God Save the Queen, the Sex Pistols, they all got gongs, they all got medals, they were made commanders of the British Empire and knights, and therefore it's a nation that can bring together a great diversity and at the same time a great gentleness. And I think the perception of this oddity, of this completely different perception of what celebrity is, of what being known throughout the world, of having this incredible soft power, that is something that fascinates. And if I can sort of pick up the thread of a lecture I gave here a couple of years back on one of the members, briefly a member of the royal family of Britain, this is the thing that the Duchess of Sussex, Meghan Markle, never understood. The Queen is not a celebrity. The monarchy is not about celebrity. It is not about success. It is about something entirely different. It is about something symbolic and symbiotic. So you're not in competition as you would be in Hollywood to get the best parts or the best salary or both. You are actually in a dynamic role in which most of the time it is better that you should say nothing. And every now and then, if you take the COVID, for instance, the example of COVID, Queen Elizabeth made 2 short speeches, 4 minutes each, and as a citizen of a country that has Emmanuel Macron for president, who every time he gets a microphone speaks for half an hour, we looked at the Queen of England and we thought, that is truly impressive. We would like more of that, please. So, so there is a fascination for that, and there's a fascination of a power which is not the power to impose anything. It's the power to inspire.
Mm-hmm. And I would add to that, since you brought up the Duke and Duchess of Sussex and the issue of monarchy and celebrity, you said it right. Monarchy is not celebrity. In fact, it's the opposite of celebrity. Monarchy is, in what it's designed to be, it's about public service, and it's about others. It's about casting the light on others rather than, as Meghan Markle casts the light upon herself. And this is a real life example of why monarchy is special, because when Charles and Camilla are out there visiting charities and hearing about national stories and praising people, they are doing exactly what monarchy is designed to do. They're uniting people and casting a light on good deeds. They're helping charities. And this is exactly what it's all about. And in my opinion, why it has a role even today that's beneficial. In America, we have nothing but celebrity. And I think most people, not myself, because I dedicate my life to studying monarchy, to writing about it, and so forth. But I think most people conflate the two. And it is a very elevating experience to have something other than yourself to shine a light, and I think that's right. The one of the reasons I wanted to ask the question was there's historical enmity almost, but not in your case because you're a complete Anglophile and French at the same time.
But you know, I do broadcasting in France, and I write for an English newspaper. But you know, when the Queen died, there was coverage in France. But I asked the channel with which I worked, and I said, "Are you doing the coronation?" And they said, "Oh, we don't think people are interested." You know, 1 month earlier. 2 weeks earlier, no, people are not interested. Suddenly they woke up the last week and they said, this is big. And throughout Paris, you had booking, journalists who are looking desperately, all the channels, they're looking for people to talk about this. They suddenly sent teams to Britain, and of course, the places to film from inside the city, because inside the Abbey, that was the BBC. All of this had been taken up by the American channels. Mm-hmm. So people looked at it, and there were more jokes, certainly in France, and there was more of a misunderstanding, but there was a kind of fascination. I know perfectly well that I write about politics, and I also write about the royal family because it's fun, and I've got a great tenderness for it. But it's, when I go and meet friends, they ask me about the royal family. They do not ask me about politics.
Well, and final thing before we open up to the floor for questions. One thing in your presentation that I sparked an idea in my head was that you said that the Republican faction was, in fact, very small. But the interesting thing is, and this affects us all in Hungary, in the United States, and wherever, so much media attention was given to that very small minority. So I'd like to hear your reaction to that.
Yes. The whole idea that you have a connection with a family that has been in your country forever, for as long as your country has existed practically, that is not something that is either urban, elitist, or fashionable. And therefore, I would say that if you look at, the large cities, if you look at the intelligentsia, if you look at the elite or self-described elite, these are not the people who like the monarchy, because they feel that they actually, how can I possibly sort of be interested in something like that? And I will quote George Orwell, extraordinary writer, read everything, and read the journalism before you read the novels. And Orwell wrote in an article for, I think, Tribune in the mid-30s, he said that there's a certain type of intellectual who would rather steal from a poor box, a place where you put money for the poor in a church, than sing God Save the King. So that is not from yesterday. There's a sort of inverse snobbery in a part of the elite, which is, most of the time left-wing. And they look down on this. And the whole notion of, I would say, sort of, a certain type of transubstantiation. The king was touched with had the unction of the holy oils. There is a direct filiation of something that is spiritual, and I found really moving that the Prime Minister, who is a practicing Hindu, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, read a passage from the Bible, because in that service, which was an Anglican service, a Christian service, other faiths were invited to join in what was the notion of the spiritual. And that was very impressive. He also was the best reader of them all, but that was really something.
And I'll throw this out to the audience for comment. Can you think of anything that's more anti-woke in principle than monarchy, which is tradition and history, everything that the woke are trying to cancel? And so it's very interesting to see how the monarchy, the British monarchy, because it's very much in the public eye with Meghan Markle and Harry, who are on the woke side of things, let's face it, how this is all playing out, because it's very much part of the national debates that we talk about in politics and news. So love to open it up to questions from the audience.
Pardon me. So my question revolves around monarchy in terms of the power of monarchy, because you were talking about the Glorious Revolution and things like that. And Franz Josef was asked what the job of a modern monarch was, and he said it was the job to defend the people from the politicians. And just as medieval kings had defended their people, the common man, the farmer, from lords, malicious lords, and people like that. And while we've seen the neutering of that power in England particularly, and that has obviously contributed to the longevity, don't you think that there's a negative aspect in that King Charles, who has proven in his letters, his private letters that were released, the Black Spider letters, that he has a very warmness for the common man, for the common farmer, and for people like that? And don't you think that not having the power to be able to dissolve Parliament on his own, to be able to do a lot of the things that monarchs used to be able to do, is a negative thing when you have a good monarch who is actually looking out for the people?
Shall I sort of? My reaction to that is you're absolutely right, and the disadvantage that Charles has is he's the oldest man ever to be crowned, 74, and we know all of his opinions because when he was Prince of Wales, he wasn't under the same restrictions that the monarch is to not express opinions or political opinions, etc. So everyone knows where he's coming from. And of course, he has opinions, and of course his mother, who famously didn't express them, had opinions. But that was part of her genius and part of her success, I would say. What do you have to say?
I would say that you've also put the finger on something that's interesting, because having this sort of deep relationship over the elites, over the ruling classes in economic terms, it can be good or bad. There are dangers. The king, to some extent, can be the ultimate populist, and some kings do it. And I always worry about a monarch that would say nowadays, I mean, Franz Joseph was from such a different era, I'm here to defend you from the politicians, because unless the political system is broken, and it's never good to call broken something that isn't because people believe in it, there's also danger. But the idea that which is why the way to do it is the symbolic, entirely symbolic way of the British monarchy. And you said it yourself, Charles expressed himself, and he had the latitude to do this as Prince of Wales, but it was not well received. We now remember and we say, oh, he was in advance on his time, and we conveniently forget that he also used those letters to ministers to explain that the environment was an emergency, also used the same type of letters to ministers to defend homeopathy, which honestly is not quite on the same level. So I think it's two-pronged, that thing. And no system is perfect, and we can't say that monarchy is always perfect.
Thank you for your question. Over here, please.
I want to thank you both and to the speakers. It's really thought-provoking, and it's very, very interesting. Two angles that stand out for me. First, how interesting, Lee, that you wanted to comment about the woke bit, about the tradition. Strangely, it seems, Charles has woke complete. He is for the Princess Foundation for Climate Change. So he really has a woke agenda combined with this tradition. So that's an interesting point, if you could comment. The other bit is, I love very much, I think you brought this up about what kind of monarch is it, a kaleidoscope? It could be or someone brought up that it could be extremely autocratic, unloved, and it fails. Of course, there's war and these things. What's interesting is, and I'm thinking about the future of the British monarchy, if you're too wealthy and autocratic and the population hates you, you probably will fail. There's a chance, and this is what I'd like to hear for your comments, it's a chance that if they change it, that it's not so much haves and have-nots, that it could go into the future. So I would like to hear some more about that, if you can comment.
On the wealthy bit, you're absolutely right. And certainly there's a lot of people that are resentful that tax dollars go to pay for that. When you look at the budgets, you realize that what we spend in the United States supporting our president financially, it sort of pales in comparison. The British model pales in comparison. Plus, I don't think there's ever been a president that's brought tax dollars, that's brought tourist dollars into the country. The other thing I would say to that is that because the British monarch is not a politician, and in the United States, I'm not going to make a comment on European politicians because I don't know as well, but everything is so financially driven and fundraising driven. And the monarch, by the nature of the fact that they're apolitical, sit above it, they obviously don't ever have to fundraise. So that's something else that I think puts them in a different category that's almost above reproach and above the moral high ground. And, as far as the woke thing, I think Charles is very genuine, and that's why I'm willing to feel good about, even to disagree on the issues that I may not agree with him on. And I know there are a lot of British people who are resentful of some of those causes. But I would say, the other thing I would say is that Charles was probably talking about the environment before it ever became or defined by one side or the other. So in his case, I'm willing to suspend criticism. What do you think?
I would agree on this, because if you look at what Charles wants to achieve, he wants to conserve the countryside. He wants to conserve historic houses. And that, that's the same route as conservatism. It certainly is not revolutionary wokeism. It's the idea we have a world, we have a tradition, we have an architecture that we want to preserve. We have a society that we want to preserve. We don't want to which is why he's against extremely industrial farming. And some of this will have pushback, which is to be expected, but it is not from a woke point of view that he does that. I'm less sure about his son. Something else about the cost of the monarchy. A great deal of the amount of splendor that we've seen at the coronation has been there for a very long time. It's been paid for. They're not going to sell it, and therefore the Queen and the King have got the use of some splendid things, but if they were not being used, nothing else would happen.
They would be diminishing assets, and so it's better that they're on display during. Yes.
I have one quick question for you. And I know maybe some of the folks have the same question, and that is, particularly from the United States, there's a lot of reference to the term woke. And I would like to hear from you your opinion of what woke is, because if I were to ask 5 Americans what is woke, they have no idea. They just heard it on the news, and it's something they're running around talking about. So I would welcome your view.
This departs from the topic that I'm here to address, but as far as my opinion of what woke is, it's a departure from our thinking in a way to sort of overturn the traditional mores and to erase history and to almost apologize for the humane and greatness of our past. That's how I would define it. What would you say?
I actually have a question for the room, and especially for the Hungarians. Hungary had a much longer monarchic tradition alone as the Kingdom of Hungary, and then as the Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy. And I would like to know if any of you feels still plugged into that, how much that matters to you. If there's anybody who'd like to talk about this.
May I just say one comment before we go to that? Going back to what you were saying about Charles and the environment. He has a home in the village of Zalanului in Transylvania. And John and I stayed there, not in his home, but in one adjacent to it, in this little collection of cottages, a little small hameau, I think the French would call it. And it really does give you a sense for his sincerity in this regard, because it is the most remote place in the world. You're, first of all, in the country, and then you go many miles down an unpaved road to this very small village, and it is beautiful, beautiful country, but it is a very different kind of image than imagining some of these people who would go off to the island of Moustique or something. It is very, very rural, very beautiful, and 100% you are in nature. There's nothing else.
Actually, I'm a member of an Austro-Hungarian traditionalist movement in Vienna, and we are researching this question, what you've been just asking. And both sides of the former empire, or the multiple sides, because it's not only Austria and Hungary, but there is Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania, Slovenia, Croatia, and even part of Serbia. So it's a quite multi-ethnic question. And our experience researching this, where we are now, after this terrible 20th century, we agree, many people from all these different countries, that we should spare this 20th century. This multi-ethnical group, most probably conservative or right-wing believers, and also it's possible that some people are traditionalists from each countries. But yes, we even have Serbian people who have certain nostalgia to the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. We have Romanian people, and why? Why? That's the question. Why? Probably because the destruction of our traditional society, which in some terms maybe lasts for 1,000 years or a few hundred years. In each case, each nationality, ethnic group or region is different, but the destruction of our traditional form of statehood and the old elite was violent. And this violence not only affected the elites, not only was against the Habsburg imperial and royal dynasty, not only against our aristocracy, but throughout the 20th century, this violence reached all social levels, even against the worker class, the farmers, and finally everybody lost everything in this region, not only the Hungarians. Lucky one, the Austrians. If you see Austria today, it's a special case because that country is a jewel box in Central Europe, according to comparing the former parts of the empire in living standards, and of course. That would be a very interesting question that all these countries have a quite end of the day or end of the world feeling. The population dropping extremely. Serbia is in a tragic situation, but Croatia as well, Hungary and Slovakia and everybody else. So dropping, and actually the nostalgia is growing to the old times. And the monarchy as an establishment, it's became a symbol of stability and the good old time, as in French we say the ancien régime or le belle époque, as we say. And we use this term in French, sometimes we quoting. And this is a good question because history is teaching for us for something. Nothing is forever in history. Pantarei, everything is moving. So no political system, no regimes, no political ideas forever. But somehow the idea of monarchy survived thousands of years, since the Persian Empire, since the Roman Empire, ancient Egypt. So somehow I believe that the monarchy as an idea, it's many thousand years old. Maybe it's somehow in its seeds, in core ideas, it's same old as humankind. Then here comes the question, and that's my question to you, if you allow me. Is that possible? What is your opinion? Because our system, our establishment, the so-called free world, the Western world, the democratic world, there are many nicknames of our group of statehoods and the bloc in the world nowadays. If we go into a devastation, because there is a chance that our system, our Western establishment will fall apart. It could be anything, a war or economic crisis or social unrest. On the ruins of this Republican parliamentary multi-party political system. Maybe is that possible that after, in the post-industrial world, we will be monarchies again in some way? Maybe is there a chance, or is there any people who thinking that way in the West? Thank you very much.
I'm not enough of a prospective specialist to say this, but what comes to mind is creating a new monarchy in a system that has a broken tradition of it seems to me difficult, because what you said is the unexplainable, the fact that it has held together. When Notre Dame, the cathedral in Paris, burnt, things that fell from the roof and the spire, they fell. They could have fallen at any time, but they hadn't, because the entire building was holding together. And there's a sort of permanence of habit. And I'm not sure you can recreate out of nothing permanence of habit. And that worries me a bit. And also there will be lots of people who will think that is a brilliant idea and I can get to power that way. And Prince Charles once said that the problem when he sort of went to receptions for him is that he said, the people who immediately want to talk to you are the ones you least want to talk to, and the nice people really hold back because they don't want to be intrusive. And I'm afraid that in terms of chaos in politics, that's exactly what happens as well. So I would worry about this. But what Hungary recently has been doing in a very interesting way, you've got two ambassadors who are Habsburgs. One is Habsburg György, who's the ambassador in Paris, and he's very much appreciated. He is also the son of Otto von Habsburg, so he says, nobody can say that Hungary is not a European country because my entire family's tradition is European, and he's got the weight of the tradition, both those centuries of monarchy, but also the fact that his own father was active in this. And that's the best way to translate, I would say, a monarchic tradition into a modern tradition. And that's good. And your other ambassador is Edward Habsburg, who is in the Vatican. And his brother is a priest at the Vatican. He's a Catholic. His life has been working for the Catholic Church at one stage in Austria. And there again, that's something very clever. That's a very good way of using this old tradition, and because many things need not be said, and there's a kind of authority in the way that the Romans talked about auctoritas, which is something slightly different from what we call authority. Actually, it's almost the opposite. It's the thing that needs that you do not have to use force. That would be useful. And in other countries, as I said, in Britain, do not break it. In a country like France, it's more through respect for history and respect for the aesthetic tradition of the country. Louis XIV was an absolute monarch, and the reason why he was is that he had his own noble revolution between, I think, 1648 and 1653, called the Fronde. His own cousins fought him. The Louvre, where he was as a child, was bombarded by one of his cousins. He had to take refuge in the Château de Saint-Germain outside Paris. And he remembered this time of terrifying sort of uncertainty where his father had died, his mother, Queen Anne of Austria, was not popular, and another faction tried to take power, and he decided that, and the nobles followed some of the factions, and he decided that he would hold all those nobles together, and he will hold them in a place which he built, which is Versailles, both by their interest, because he would give them charge. They would have sort of tasks and functions that some of which were purely honorific, but certainly were paid. So that he held them with money, he had them with titles, and he held them with complete control. And he hired a bourgeois economics minister who then decided to sort of expand the French economy in a French way that exists today, which is the top-down, done by engineers, and the top decides and you get it afterwards. So you get this palace, you get those factories that the king creates in France because he wants essentially to bring in the business that goes to the Italians mostly. So we have a glass factory and then we have a hall of mirrors in Versailles because this is also a place to sell our mirrors. Everybody comes. the whole beauty of the French sort of architectural and artistic heritage is an expression of power that has been completely consciously created and that has been copied everywhere. If you take palaces in Potsdam, if you take palaces in Russia, if you take palaces in Sicily, you will see all of them were trying to imitate Versailles. And so you've got that. And the only way that you can sort of really sort of keep the idea and the admiration is down the years, as those palaces are no longer new, as the short, the cold reasoning that led to building this vision of cold beauty, that's the way that you will do it in a country like that. And each country has got to find their own identity. Poland has got an identity of resisting invaders. And that's something very, very remarkable as well. And each country, it's going to be very different. But that's how you transmute the history of a monarchy in a country that no longer has it.
And let's not forget that there have been instances where monarchies have been reestablished. And, in the last century, most of them didn't work out very well. Like in Greece, it came back, it went away. But let's also not forget that there has to be the will among the people for this to happen, because at the end of the day, in our day and age, where there are constitutional monarchs who only have ceremonial power, they serve at the behest of the people. And if they become so unpopular, this is why the United Kingdom is constantly having referendums, because they can monitor, they can see if there needs to be course correction, etc. But right now, even the most far-flung independent corners of the Commonwealth realms like Australia, they're still in support of having it. They may be fiercely independent, but there's something that they don't want to give it up. And also, it's perhaps unfashionable, or I don't know, you'll be accused of being romantic. I don't mind that. I own up to it. I'm absolutely entranced by monarchy. It stirs watching King Charles be crowned stirred my heart, and it made me feel good about humanity. And that's also perhaps, we live in a more secular age, and monarchy suffuses religion with civil society, with politics, inevitably. And I really regret that we're losing our attachment to those things, because I think they make us less civilized, and they open the door for a lot of things that are coming in that I personally don't necessarily, directions I don't want to see society go in. So I think monarchy can keep things on track, they can keep things stable, they can keep things unified without being autocratic, without being absolute. And I would encourage Serbia and everybody that you mentioned, to consider going in that direction, because I think it's cohesive for society, and at the end of the day, it's really a good thing. Is it going to happen? I don't know.
Thank you very much. As has been noted, the coronation brought together many strands of tradition and continuity. That heritage is now being challenged from various directions in the West. Do you think the royal family should go down the route of making reparations, perhaps apologizing for perceived injustices, or should they stay aloof from that kind of tendency?
I would make the case that Britain was the country that was fiercest in abolishing slavery, that was earliest in abolishing slavery, that for 30 years privateers transporting slaves and merchant ships transporting slaves into America were being stopped by the British Navy. The hero of that is a man called William Wilberforce, but he had the support of Pitt, the younger in this, the Prime Minister. And unfortunately, slavery has existed since the ancient times. The Greeks had slaves. The Greeks enslaved even the people in neighboring islands. They were metics, which became metek in French. The Romans had slaves, as we very well know. Most nations had slaves. The Russians had slaves. The Turkish Empire, which was a colonial empire for longer than any of the Western European colonial empires, had slaves and Barbary markets for slaves. Lots of the Arabian Peninsula bought slaves from Africa. It's the idea that there has to be this sort of demonstration of abjectness is something that, to me, is part of a discourse that is essentially an anti-West discourse that has been flourishing nowadays for political reasons. And it sounds, it's one of those ideas, as H.L. Mencken in America said, there's an idea that is simple, seductive, easy to understand, and wrong. And it's there's the idea that you're going to apologize for something that you had nothing to do with, and that you're going to sort of spot a certain group of people, and they carry a guilt that makes it impossible for them to defend anything else that they do, because there is this sort of original sin that is sort of attributed to them before they open their mouth. It is an extremely clever weapon. It's very well, it's fantastically formulated. It's got lots of what Lenin used to call useful idiots who are peddling it around the world, but I think, no, absolutely not.
Right. No, I completely agree with that. And the only other thing that I'd add is that slavery was never legal in the realms of the United Kingdom. Certainly there were Brits like others that got rich off of the slave trade, but and that furthermore, I would say that the bloodshed that was expended and the expense that were expended by the British Navy, and they were among the first to address the abolition of slavery. So, years before my own country did, and even in our case in the United States, we fought a war and lost many, many lives. We've addressed this issue, and it's offensive to be asked to pay for it now when we've addressed this 2 centuries ago.
Thank you. Look, I want to go back to the question the traditionalist gentleman at the back asked. I wonder if one element of this isn't that with, for example, the strong emotional public reaction to the death of the Queen, particularly illustrates that I began with, is her acceptance of a lifelong duty is an extreme example of something of a choice that every human being has to make, and on which there are 2 views. At some point in our lives, we are asked to fulfill obligations we have not chosen. And some people rebel against that, and indeed there are entire political theories now dominant that actually rebel against this. But in the case of, in other words, we may have to take care of elderly parents. We didn't choose that duty, but it's there. And if we run away from such duties, well, obviously, we will, in a sense, come to see ourselves as in some way deficient as people. I think in popular culture, this is very clear. I'll take 2 examples of films: the Prisoner of Zenda and the Four Feathers, in which the heroes who are tempted to behave badly, one has done so, one has not, but tempted to behave in a sense selfishly, although actually it's not very selfish, but selfishly, the 2 women tell them, look, we were born to obligations we didn't choose, but if we don't fulfill them, we will make everybody around ourselves, our families and friends, unhappy and depressed. Depressed, not take away depressed. They'll be fun. Now, I wonder whether we can't look at Prince Harry as someone who is, in a sense, in the popular view, fleeing from this obligation, and in the way his great uncle did, and that in a sense, there is something in monarchy which makes it possible for people in their own lives to bear these kind of obligations, and that completes kind of the picture of the political system. Most of the political system in democracies is not dedicated to popularizing sacrifice and duty. It's dedicated to popularizing having an easy life, and I can well understand that and don't disapprove of it. But nonetheless, there is this other element which has to be there, and if that isn't there in the political system, we will think less well of it.
Well, look, yes. One of the aspects of monarchy that I spoke about in my portion was the hereditary aspect. So celebrities and politicians choose to become what they become, and in a hereditary system of monarchy where there's a royal family and other things, they don't. So Prince Harry didn't choose to be, at one point, second or third in line to the throne, and that was just the lottery of life. It's not what he wanted for a number of reasons, just like his great uncle, the Duke of Windsor, didn't want that, although it was a different situation because he was actually the monarch, and Harry's much further away from the pecking order. But also, on the promise issue, Queen Elizabeth is in so many ways an admirable figure and earned the world's respect, not just her own nation. I mean, even the French, for God's sake, respected her. So having said that, there is something about this promise aspect and holding us. The monarchy, at best, make us better versions of ourselves. I hate that trite expression, but it's true, because we have an example. In a way, not to take it too far, but Christ was an example. We don't see the presence of God, we can only feel it, but monarchy is a little bit in between, and that's why I believe there are good aspects of it, and I'm glad that even if my own nation didn't preserve it, I'm glad there are places in the world that did, because we can look to people who are self-sacrificing and dutiful and admirable and want the best for the world and for that's at best what it is. I know not everybody, not every monarch is like that, but at best that's what it is, and that was the example, I believe, in the legacy of Queen Elizabeth, and hopefully her son will measure up. And what do you have to say?
I would agree that Queen Elizabeth was one of a kind. As a woman, I'm extremely impressed by the fact that most queens of Britain, reigning queens, were extraordinary beings, and that's something to admire. From Boudica to Elizabeth II, including Elizabeth I and Victoria, that is something. I would, Elizabeth II has set such an obvious path by example that her son, who's been the understudy, as you are in a Broadway musical, the understudy to the star, when does the straw break her leg? And fortunately for us all, the Queen went at 96. But obviously Prince William, the now Prince of Wales, also has had this very well it's mapped out for him. He's accepted this. He was taught by his grandmother when he was at school at Eton, which is a public school, which in English, and British English means private school, just on the other side of a valley from Windsor Castle. He would go every week, spend an afternoon with his grandmother, and sometimes with law professors, in order to learn all those details of constitutional law that were not necessarily in the program at Eton. Prince George has got two parents who love one another and who are committed to duty, and therefore, you've got three generations that more or less are guaranteed. And not every family is blessed by royal family is blessed by this continuity and this sense of time. Monarchy, in many ways, if you wanted to use only one word for monarchy, you would say time, because monarchy is about long term. By definition, and every elected politician, even if they mean well, they say, look, I mean, there are things I can't pass through because I will get defeated and it will be useless. Our president, Emmanuel Macron, had to pass a bill on pensions. You can discuss about how well he passed it, but certainly he thought, I'm going to do this, and it's absolutely destroyed the rest of his mandate because he became so unpopular. So. There's the element that you don't do something because you're going to be re-elected, you do something because it needs to be done. Monarchs are, fallible because we're all human, we all know that.
I think I am one of the very few people at the age of 25 who would love to see the restoration of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire.
I applaud you.
Thank you. But I've been to a few monarchist events in Budapest, and what I saw almost all the time, that most of the crowd who were there were, and I don't want to offend anyone in the room, were above the age of 65 or 70. My theoretical question is the following. What are the pillars, or what can be the pillars of a successful monarchist movement in a country where there has been the institution of monarchy since, let's say, the foundation of the country?
It's everybody should come up with something, but what Lee said, service. So there's a tradition in families and in noble families in Hungary, actually, to do good works. And that's part of it. It's not saying I want to restore a regime, but I want to restore the functions that any sort of free citizen can do in order to bring to make my country better. And that would be a good beginning. Otto von Habsburg is really a fantastic example. But if you look at Prince Schwarzenberg in the Czech Republic, and he himself is, they didn't restore any kind of monarchy. But that is, I would say, the way is show by example, and it's got to be about as distant, as far away as possible from sort of the idea that I personally, I want to restore my job. It's the opposite. It's working for the country, and I think that's the best way to do it. I would say your Prime Minister got the idea. I mean, it's very obvious. He knew what he was doing. I've no idea whether he wants to restore the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but he certainly knows a lot about it.
One big challenge, of course, is that the Brits have a jump on everyone because they have an unbroken line that goes back more than 1,000 years. And, at that time, there was divine right of kings, which, I don't think too many believe that anymore. But when you witness the mystery of the coronation and the anointing and all of that ceremony, which is not quasi, it is religious. And I think it's hard for a country that had that at one time but wants to have it again. How do you do it? I mean, do you find there are still people related to those families? So I suppose that's how you could do it. That's one way. But I think the best is to never lose it, and that's why I pray that they won't lose it in the UK. We've got two.
Yeah. I'm mindful of the fact we're running out of time, but there's been a lot of talk about the top of the monarchy system, the monarch. I would be interested in hearing your thoughts about the lower ranks of the monarchy, the peerage and the function and value of the House of Lords. And it's a huge topic, I know, but if somehow in democracies around the world there would be use for, say, life peerages or hereditary positions.
I think Lee knows a lot about this, but the House of Lords as it is today has been wrecked by Tony Blair for political reasons. And he did that by saying, these people are there entirely by chance. It's stochastic, and therefore we don't want it. We do not want something that happens by chance. And so they replaced a lot of the hereditary peers who were empowered to be in Parliament by essentially friends of whoever was in place. And the joke in London was, the cronies of Tonys. It has not helped. What was interesting about the House of Lords, it was the fact that the members of the House of Lords, and you have a few left who sit in the House of Lords, they were totally disinterested. And some of them, there aren't enough seats in the room for all the peers, which in itself is very symbolic. It's we don't expect that they will all be there at the same time and that all of them will be interested in making a speech in the House. So what you have is the accumulation of tradition, including, the bad ones, the ones who ruined the family, the ones who had a sort of strange and mysterious life. Let's not even go into Lord Lucan, but that would be interesting. I'll tell you about this later with the drinks. But you have people who are there precisely because they've not been ambitious and wanted to get there. They have a sense of duty because if only the duty is that, please, let my castle roof not fall down, it still is a duty. But they usually have also a sense of duty to the people who work on the estate, to the people who are in the area where the family has lived for several centuries. So it's a much more diffuse interest. But it's interesting, next to people who are professionals in politics, and you need professional politicians. We have right now Emmanuel Macron picked lots of untried people to be MPs in France, to run for parliament, and in his cabinet we see people who have no experience whatsoever. And that teaches you that people who've got the experience of politics, who know what it's like to compromise, who know how to horse trade, all sorts of things, these are necessary as well. I don't want to say that but it's nice to have different people. It brings a diversity. It's an interesting diversity. And the life peers who've been added, not all of them, and life peers were added before the House of Lords was entirely destroyed by Tony Blair. Not entirely, but, mostly. And so the idea is to bring in people who've got experience, and not necessarily people you want to reward because they've given money to whichever party was there, but, people who bring experience, and that's an experience that our American friends would call out of left field.
Well, I don't necessarily agree with the last thing that you said, because the out of left field, we Americans, we thought we ran so far from the British system and so far from the monarchy. What do? We elect a monarch, a temporary monarch, and the House of Lords is really similar to the Senate, where terms are 3 times as long as they are in the lower house, and there is so much similarity in there. It's based on that same principle of taking the long view. I mean, yes, you're still elected, and yes, there's still a finite term, but we really didn't get very far away from the same principles. Why? Because they work. So it's just we feel better saying. So thank you very, very much for your kind attention and for your very interesting and enlightened questions. It was really fun to do this, and thank you all for having us.
Well, I want to, on behalf of you, I want to thank our speakers, 2 speakers here and our other speakers from outside. I think we have to find some way of getting Professor Becci's remarks to you at some point, maybe through the web and so on. But I want to say it's been as always, when we touch upon these kind of questions, we discover there's far more interest and far more to know about them than we perhaps think at the beginning. I would say myself that you couldn't ever invent, for example, the House of Lords as it was, say, at the end of the 1960s, but it did 3 things. It represented all the unrepresented, because these were ordinary. This was the accident of birth. It represented expert opinion who could give advice. And finally, its composition its basis was such that it could never challenge the democratic authority of the Commons, which meant, therefore, that there was not likely to be a constitutional crisis because there are two houses of Parliament. As I say, like the monarchy itself, it's the product of what has come to be and has worked in practice. And I think that is, in a way, at the end of the day, the justification for any constitutional system. And in the case, of course, of the monarchy, you may not be able to reproduce it even if it existed in the past. But new forms of excellence may arise, and then we should try to accommodate them when they do. But look, we've had excellence tonight on the stage. So I'm going to thank you and people outside. Thank you very much.